So we arrive in the final region of the game, the Straits of Devastation. Now, if you watched earlier in the playlist when we were at Frostgorge Sound, we were technically in a higher level map here. We're back down to 70 to 75 this time. And it's quite a small level range, which is funny because you can get so much experience here. This is a map filled with meta events. D-Day, Normandy beach landing style experience of going from the Tyrian mainland into the Orion Peninsula across the waters. This map and the two after it, all in all, are kind of structured a bit differently in that way, that they're very meta-focused, and they do not have renown hearts. Which I think is kind of a cool idea, because, you know, ArenaNet added renown hearts almost as like a tack-on to make sure people knew how to get to events and stuff. And at the end of the game, in theory, you don't need that anymore, but hopefully by the end of the game, you're familiar with doing events first and foremost. I guess you could look at it more cynically and say that they didn't have time to do renown hearts here, but I really don't think that's true. I think they were kind of hoping that people would sort of transition into an event mindset. And if you look at a lot of the immediate post-release content, hearts weren't really being utilized or around. I think they wanted to get away from it and the problems that had obviously come from them. So let's talk a little bit about where we are. Tezeto Bay. We're going to see an amazing fort called Fort Trinity in a second, but before that, I have to show you Guild Wars 1 before we leave this shore. Now, all three of the Orion maps don't really overlap with Guild Wars 1 because this wasn't available in the first game. This is all new territory. That's part of the magic of these areas and a big part of the experience for us original fans. But it is still true that the Straits of Devastation Northern Shore, while we're still on the Tyrian mainland, you'll see we do overlap with the south of Sparkfly Fen. Now, why that's interesting is the Bloodstone Caverns. That was a dungeon in the original game that's actually kind of a really significant dungeon because it revealed the resting place of one of the shards of the Bloodstone, which is like really important, especially in the Elder Dragon story. The idea is the Elder Dragons want magic, and magic was sealed away from them by one of the previous ancient races, and they're kind of spread all over the place now. At one point in the Guild Wars 2 story, we do end up interacting with one of these shards of the Bloodstone, and big stuff happens there. It's a huge event. But there's all these other shards sitting around. One of them is in the Bloodstone Caverns. And you know what's really interesting? Right here in 2012, Straits of Devastation, the devs didn't just ignore the existence of that cave. Here in the Straits, there is a hidden, like, mini cave that you have to look really closely for on this northern wall. And if you sneak in there, you can find a totally optional area, no map completion there, no events there, no quests there ever take you there. But you can find this doorway, this mysterious doorway that is, as far as I remember, like a unique asset, like a specific entrance into this cave. So it's a lot like the ban at Brisbane Bridge. It's hinting very directly. They put this specific effort in to show, hey, this entrance to this cave is still here, remember it. And, you know, it's in one of the late game maps as well. And for that reason, if you watch my videos through the years since this game's come out, you'll often hear me speculating in lore, like, oh, maybe we'll go back here, maybe this shard of the Bloodstone's now going to become relevant. And it always could have been. Every single patch, really, that deals at all with an Elder Dragon or someone power hungry could have dealt with this cave, because it's a great place for them to go and get some more power. But so far, the devs have done nothing with it. So far, absolutely nothing. Who knows whether they ever will. So, Fort Trinity. Now, this place is incredible. I told you guys when launch came out that instead of making a beeline, me and a friend just went and explored a ton of the Ascalon areas, the Char areas, and we kind of beelined that way instead, and we ended up leveling a lot. Now, while that's true, I also, and I don't know how this slots into that other anecdote I gave you, I also have a memory of being here with no idea what the hell any of this was. I had not played the personal story far enough. I think I was just kind of exploring, and I came to this map. I never crossed the waters or anything because I realized I was into serious territory. But I found this Fort Trinity. I didn't know who the Pact was or any of that. I didn't know how this had been built, but it was fascinating to me, and it really motivated me to get back into the personal story because it was just such a cool and wild and curious and mysterious place. Of course, we do find out a lot about the architecture that is kind of a blending of all the efforts involved of the various people within the Pact. You've got the airships. So that vista we just went on there, I go on that vista all the time if daily Orion Vista comes up. It's such an easy vista to get to. But it's a cool airship, and you know, there's several missions and things where that airship actually leaves the fort and does stuff. In the game nowadays, they would dynamically move that around, but not so much here. And speaking of airships, by the way, at any point now that we're in this final region of the world, there's such a beautiful thing to see. If you look up into the sky, you'll see dragons versus airships all over the place. Really incredible. And wisely, the devs put them so far high up in the sky that even with stuff like the Springer and the Skyscale and the Griffin and stuff nowadays, it's very difficult to get anywhere near them. So, you know, the illusion of the fact that they probably have no collision and stuff and their fights are meaningless isn't broken because you can't really get up there. So this is probably some of the last map completion we'll do on the mainland. I always feel like this is a significant moment, especially when you know the full size of the Tyrian world map, that this is not just what we see in game. This is like a supercontinent. It expands like thousands of miles off to the east, and here we are at the coast of it all. I really like that. Anyway, this room is kind of cool. It's especially if you're a ranger, because this room kind of has a spattering of loads of different pets. So maybe the idea is that ore is really challenging environment, and any rangers that kind of missed out on some pets with important utility, you can kind of come into this cave and pick up some more for your collection to be ready. Of course, that only works if ore actually is challenging, and it only works if the pet balance was really good and rangers were really reliant on the exact pet that they were using and stuff, none of which is true. But it's still nice. It's a cool little thing. In my full Let's Play, I actually did one of the last shots here, showing you guys this, and you get this jetty. There's a story here. I did show this, which I'm quite happy to have done. Nice little extra thing in Straits of Devastation. That was in the last episode, right before the montage, where if you guys go back and watch that montage I did, I edit on screen everyone's map completion scores, and there's like really tiny. It's like, okay, you've just seen this character for 60 hours. We've watched 5 characters. There's like 120 videos in this series, and guess what? They got 10% map comp, right? That's one of the things that really motivated me to do this, because finally I'm actually showing it all, you know? I'm showing it all, which is great. So as we move down now into ore, Straits is kind of separated into 3 different assaults that can happen at once, or more realistically separately, especially with the way that the meta is set up now. We're at the southern assault, which is kind of like a land assault. This is not, you know, ore is a peninsula. It's not an island. It is connected to the mainland, but it's connected way further south. This is not the connection. Where it's actually connected is way down at a place called the Scavenger's Causeway, which has never existed in either game. We've never been able to visit. I think the closest we can get is maybe in Path of Fire, or hell here. Speaking of Path of Fire, this open body of water is called the River Elon, or the Sea of Ellen, which kind of suggests how it connects to the Ellen River, which exists way down in that expansion. Kind of an interesting thought. Lots of big open waters. So yeah, this southern invasion is kind of like the land invasion, if you will. But the idea is these bodies of water that the Pact have built bridges across. Probably in the actual story, you know, the game engine is limited in its scale of what it can show. In the actual story, I imagine these are like gargantuan bridges that, you know, span a lot of water, like these huge mega engineering constructs. I was actually reading on Wikipedia the other day about a railway that was built in the UK, a railway bridge, I should say, that was built in the UK in like the late 1800s. Somewhere up north, in a great storm, it fell apart, and it was all about the architect and the guy who built it and how it became destitute afterwards. I think of it as like projects like that, you know, that are constrained in one another in one way or another, and it's all risky and it's all crazy, but we got to get tanks onto the mainland somehow, and so this is how we do it. This is the southern invasion. So this jumping puzzle you just saw me do, probably one of the most significant lore areas in the entire game. Really incredible. A ton of brilliant hints and amazing stuff there. That's the Vizier's Tower. So, of course, the story of Ore, it was a prosperous, magical nation filled with, you know, wizards and incredibly powerful people that the human gods themselves used to live there. And even after the human gods left, the Oriens kept where those gods had been, pristine and clean and beautiful. Like, it's the most beautiful place you can imagine. And then, during the events of Guild Wars 1, it is destroyed by a man who reads some forbidden lost scrolls, probably related to Zaitan, who was asleep underneath. The whole thing sunk down. That jumping puzzle we just did, that's where the scroll was written. It's Vizier Kilbron's tower. Vizier Kilbron, you gotta understand, is not just a big part of the Orien story. He's like the main villain for the 2006 prophecy stuff. When this game was introduced, who was the big bad? Was it the Elder Dragons? No. Was it the gods? No. It was Vizier Kilbron. He is the original bad guy. And that is a very, very important place for him. That's where a lot of the story happened that as yet was untold. It was off screen. And so you can go there, and even better, you know, they've got like this journal that you can read about the priory being at that location and sets up mysteries. They've got a bust of the Massart there that's been slashed. It looks like Vizier Kilbron hated them and so on. It's really good. And so I love that they put actual map completion up there. There's a Vista up there and a hero challenge. And is there a POI there as well? There's a lot of reasons to go there. So it's great, and I love that they put that effort in. That's a shame. That player was in the downstate and just got defeated as we tried to massive visit's body, it looked like. Or maybe I misinterpreted the footage a little bit. So anyway, yeah, that's the southern assault. Now we're in central. So central and northern are kind of water assaults. Northern is kind of hybrid. Northern has us going through the water, but it also has this cool thing where the Asura have built massive cannons that launch golems across it. And they land on the beach on the far side. So it's kind of like a terrestrial assault. So it's kind of like an airborne. I guess maybe the idea is we've got Army, Navy, Air Force, something like that going on. But yeah, here in the central, you got all these submarines that will move across. It's pretty nice the way that ArenaNet does it. Very buggy and weird and janky in a lot of ways. So it kind of loses a bit because of the implementation. But I really appreciate it that you get to actually play some events where you see submarines swimming from one shore to the other and then sieging the lands on the other side and trying to take the place away from the Risen, which is pretty nice. So this next objective we're going to go to is a really fascinating one, especially maybe for some of the biggest, deepest stories about Guild Wars 2. So around this statue of Melandru, and around many of the statues of Melandru, you can find these spirits. So obviously there are spirits in this franchise. The Canthons were very adept at summoning spirits and communing with them. And, you know, you've even got, like, in Guild Wars 2, the Renegade and stuff. There are the spirits of the wild that the Norn believe in. There's sort of a version of that the Coden believe in. And yet here is really weird. In awe, and only in awe, around these statues. And you can see what a nightmare they are to channel, by the way. We'll get Massive Viz up again in a second. You can find spirits. Now, they're kind of like copies of regular things, so that there's like a jellyfish, right? But it's called a Spirit of Sorrow. And there's loads of versions of them. There's like the Spirit of Indulgence and the Spirit of like Harrowing or whatever. I can't remember what all the specific names are. But they look like natural creatures that live on Tyria, but they're like ghostly. And you could just interpret that as, oh, cool, there's a ghost, you know, it lived here and it became a ghost. That's it. But you got to understand, they're not risen. And Zaitan has kind of tried to take control of everything here. But Zaitan can't seem to touch those spirits. They just sort of exist there. And there's no story about them. But the devs did go out of their way to specifically put them in. And I think that there's a lot of big hints here in Awe, this grand magical place, that does hint at the really, really deep stories. So currently, as I produce this video, we've been talking about the idea that maybe the spirits of the wild are really, really deeply associated with the Elder Dragon cycle. And if we go to Cantha, where they also know and do a lot with spirits, we might get answers on these, which is really nice. Little POI there as well. So that POI, again, is another one of these big sunken buildings. That is the Abaddon temple. So within Awe, we're going to find there are these massive temples to all of the human gods. But Abaddon, who was a fallen god that the gods tried to purge from history, his temple is out here in the water, which is like beautifully poetic and stuff because he was the god of water. He was the god that rebelled against them and they, you know, tried to get rid of any existence he'd ever been around. So I like the idea that when he died, his temple flooded either because the gods deliberately made it so that no one would remember him in enough time, or there's also the story of how it was the Crystal Sea, and then after Abaddon was defeated, it all dried up and became the Crystal Desert. And his chosen people, the Marganites, sailed on the sea, and now he and they all got cast down. So maybe the idea is, well, where did all that water go when the Crystal Desert became a sea? And so maybe that's why we see all these flooded areas around Awe. I talked in a previous video about like the logistics of why Lion's Arch is flooded now, even though there existed a time where Awe was raised and Lion's Arch was fine. And I was talking about how a lot of the Orient areas are flooded, and it's like, why are they flooded? Well, maybe it's that. Maybe all this water here is kind of like displaced from the nearby-ish Crystal Desert. So you've got all these big events, you know, of the land being destroyed and sinking and coming back up, and another land near here, the Crystal Desert, has a similar story of once upon a time being filled with water and not. And, you know, it makes me sad almost to think about, because it's like Abaddon created this beautiful lush ocean that could sustain life and people that lived on it. And then it was just kind of destroyed. And it's not a coincidence to me either that it's the Forgotten that we find living in the Crystal Desert years later, because they're kind of allies of the gods in a way, and they sort of maybe knew a lot about why that was all there and how that got constructed. So back down at the Southern Assault, we are at the doors. Do you see that door is actually shut now? So I think ArenaNet had a really cool idea for Straits of Devastation when they were implementing it that never happened in the end. And that was, I think they didn't want you exploring deeper into the region unless you did the metas. Like, this is that thing of map completion never being locked off because of events. But they couldn't quite do it. So they had the idea of waypoints, and they could actually turn waypoints on or off, make them contested and stuff. So think about a whole map. All the waypoints are contested, so you can't, by any means, skip in there unless you do the events or something. So you get all these players filled with endgame zergs late game, and it's like, this is a big part of endgame, right? You got to remember, Guild Wars 2 had like a distinct sort of almost feeling lack of endgame due to the way that a lot of their systems crumbled, but the ideas were there, and I think that this was meant to be a place that people did a lot of in endgame. And it's kind of true, once champ bags came out, we did do a lot of this, but not right there in the early moments. And the reason is, people skip the meta events. You don't need to do the metas for any story, and you don't need to do the metas to explore, because you can just come to this swamp down here, or any number of other places, and even now with mounts, like, you can go anywhere and just jump over the walls, and you can ignore any place that there isn't ever set up a bone wall. So now they're just, like, kind of annoying. Like, the whole thing kind of broke down. And especially, I think the thing that the devs had to wrestle with was, so what if the Straits of Devastation are completely locked off? I can just skip to the next map along, you know? And once upon a time, with the old server infrastructure, they could do stuff that was a little bit more interesting, but nowadays they certainly can't. An example of the more interesting stuff is, you remember when we were trying to channel at that statue of Melandria and we were getting interrupted constantly? Well, way deeper in one of the later maps, there is a great temple to Melandria, and if the Pact claims it, at launch, all the other statues in all the maps would flip, all the Melandria associated ones, and there would no longer be risen around them. Instead, it would be like earth elementals, who you can kill for lodestones, and were generally much more pleasant to be around. And the Melandria statues, which pulse a negative effect to be next to, suddenly they're not pulsing that negative effect. So there was this idea where, like, the more temples you claimed, the safer you were making ore in all three maps at once. And also the more profitable you were making ore in all three maps at once. Which is why it's so beautiful, which right outside the very final dungeon where this all ends, there's this plaza filled with these statues. So if you were in a server that had all the temples at once, you had this plaza in front of the final dungeon with all these enemies you could kill for lodestones and potentially get like lots of money, and it was, you know, way more pleasant to be there. And that would help you in these long meta events as well, you know. If you're doing a meta event where you're pushing through these maps, maybe you really want that help. Nowadays, though, with mega servers, none of that works, and in these earlier maps, the statues are, like, always just against you. It kind of sucks. In fact, I think it really sucks, and that's not me just waxing poetic and reminiscing about old systems that now are a little bit defunct. I just think that there was something very beautiful going on here, but it's been undermined by various things. Like this waypoint here, for example, this central base. Eventually, the devs just kind of had to make this a permanently available waypoint. So all three of the original assaults that we've been watching in the footage so far, or the territory that they exist in, they all come to this one base, and then they push out from this base to take out the Temple of Balthazar, which is the first one. And so I've always wondered as well whether it was originally designed that all three assaults had to get in there to that cave and assist them before it would happen, the final push to Balthazar. But the funny thing is, you only need one. So now it's even worse, where it's like, okay, Straits has all these cool assaults, but the southern one's the easiest and the fastest, so let's just all do that. And now nobody's doing northern and no one's doing central. That's just an example. I don't actually know which one is the most efficient. And so, or even worse, you want to push all three at once for this big epic idea that there's this huge war, you know, this Normandy landing style thing going on. So you split three Zergs across the map, only to find that one of them makes it really quickly, and now the Balthazar event's going on, and you're really awkwardly being asked to abandon the meta you're doing to go to another one, because otherwise you'll miss out and that's it, it's over. So that totally sucks, and it's another reason why people just kind of all glomp together into one Zerg instead of splitting out. You will see that as the game goes along, ArenaNet try this kind of map many times in various other campaigns that the story will deal with, and other dragon stories and so on. So, and I think they get better in some ways and worse in other ways, but this was their first crack at it, and it's interesting to see. So let's talk about Balthazar a little here as well, who is very nearby. That is the one temple here, and in many ways, it's like the most special temple of them all. And the hardest temple of them all. At launch, this thing was brutally difficult. It was, in fact, I would go as far to say, this whole open world series, all the meta events you've glimpsed, and all the regular events that you've glimpsed, and that we've talked about in world bosses, this was the hardest one, by far. And quite rightly so as well, because, and so it would take place here, you'd have to escort all these NPCs up here, they'd get swarmed, and if they die, they don't come back to life and you fail. So most of the time you would fail before you even got to the fight. Then if you could escort them all the way right here, you would have a fight for this plaza, which sometimes the Pact can own, or sometimes the dragon can own. Right now you're looking at it with the dragon, and these fireballs, this is an example of the environmental effects that interrupt you and stuff. So this is where you fight him, and the devs were not scared to make him a grueling challenge. The reward for beating him was obsidian shards. So in Guild Wars 1, there were two big endgame currencies for like the ultimate elite armor. There were obsidian shards and there were globs of ectoplasm. It turned out in the economy of the original game that obsidian shards were not worth much and were rather common, but globs of ecto became worth a lot and were the really rare thing. I think what ArenaNet tried to do in Guild Wars 2 was honor both of those items, globs of ecto and obsidian shards, and what they tried to do was reverse the scarcity. What they did was they made it so that globs of ectoplasm in Guild Wars 2 are very abundant and are used in crafting nearly everything of rare and exotic quality items. But then obsidian shards were really specific. They only came from here, and it was a nightmare of a boss fight, and they cost heaps of karma. This was like the one meaningful karma sink in the game. And in that way, for a very brief time at launch, I would actually say ArenaNet succeeded as well. They'd kind of flipped it. And now obsidian shards were the really interesting sought-after thing, and ecto was slightly less, but they were both nonetheless endgame currencies. Then, over the years, they kind of just went back on all that. First of all, power creep made the boss easy. Second of all, they added obsidian shards in tons of other areas. They realized they needed more incentive for players to do one thing or another. So they started dumping karma everywhere, and the karma sink kind of difficulty went away to a certain degree. They've now fixed that in even more recent years with extremely expensive minis and stuff. But then beyond that, they started just adding obsidian shards straight up to like other formats of the game and just all over the place now. So if you're a Guild Wars 2 player these days, you're really not going to think there's anything special about the Balthazar fight. But hey, you've got other expansions and fun things to focus on there. So yeah, but I have many, many fond memories of really trying to work on that and having a serious challenge of a time. By the way, there's some other great events here. The metas don't actually push right to the exit of the map, but there are still events that trigger, like where you can set up, where the Orions set up like anti-air to take out charcopters, and you've got to destroy their things before the copters get shot out of the sky. And there's squads that get, you know, parachuted in and have their broken tanks, and, you know, you can buy various environmental weapons for them if you complete their stuff. There's a hidden meta event here. I think it's fair to call it hidden, where there's a whole tomb gauntlet to the to the very south of the map, sorry, while you're on the Orion mainland, with a special boss at the end, an Eye of Zaitan, which is a very, very kind of elite minion that you usually only see in the personal story. There's very few of them out in the open world, but you can fight him, and he actually has a very rare drop too. At launch, no one knew what that meta was for or whether it had a rare drop. And there was an unimplemented weapon called the Final Rest, I think it was, which was a staff skin that looked like a scythe. Now, they're pretty common in the game nowadays, but back then, that was very, very, very special. People really wanted one. The only other way to get one was from the first Halloween event. But no one knew where to get it. It was supposedly in-game. The devs even confirmed that it was in-game, sending everyone into a frenzy. And the going theory was that it was this hidden meta event in Straits of Devastation, because no one ever did it. No one ever fought that Eye of Zaitan. So, and I got on that train. I would do that very regularly too. turned out no one could find it for, you know, several weeks, maybe even months after this. And finally, the devs revealed that, whoopsie, sorry guys, no, we did mess up. Our bad, it's a bug. And the truth is that the item was coming from the Shadow Behemoth meta event. And I don't mind. People make mistakes. I don't mind the mistake, and I had fun doing the meta and stuff. What really upset me, though, was after that happened and they, so to speak, fixed the loot table or the bug, they made the item ludicrously common. So it was like this really cool special stuff. And I think that when they re-implemented it, they should have kept the scarcity up because it had this great story about it. And, you know, the more unique loot that Guild Wars 2 has, the better. But then it was just dropping from the Shadow Behemoth left, right, and center. And it's still a cool skin, I suppose. There's many Scythe skins now. So it's got many brothers and sisters to choose from. And I suppose the story's still there. Here I am telling it to you guys in 2020. But it's not an experience anymore. So, yeah, I remember looking at the trading post after all that happened and seeing it was on there already. And it was super cheap. And it was a little bit sad times. Oh, also, there's an amazing underwater farm here where you do this event nearby, and you could scale it for a long time as well. And I remember, like, power traders and power farmers trying to keep this one hidden, because so many were getting nerfed after the champ bag change. You got a lot of T6 mats on this one as well. So there you go, that's it. That's the start of all, the Straits of Devastation. Thank you so much to TechZoom for the footage. 2 more maps now, guys, and we're going to be full of really amazing and interesting things to say as we go, because as far as lore's concerned, this is going to be one of the best regions of the whole game. I'll see you guys for the next one very soon. God, I keep running out of footage.